Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, as part of these history hangouts, we like to bring you some of the great work being done by scholars who have used the historical resources held in the Hagley Library, especially scholars who have received support in the form of research grants and fellowships of different kinds from the Hagley Center. One such scholar joins me today. Stephanie Doktor is Assistant Professor of Music Studies at Temple University. Steph, thanks for joining me today.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're so welcome. Let's start by painting with broad strokes, so to speak. What is it you're researching and writing about?
So right now I'm working on a book called Reconstructing Whiteness, and it's about race in the early jazz marketplace. So I'm was focusing on my first chapter, which is looking at a kind of political economy of jazz, of this really important foundational moment in the recording industry and what that has to do with jazz, basically, and ideas of Blackness and the kind of struggle to decide who gets to be in charge of representations of Black music, right? Who gets to benefit from this commodity. And part of the argument is that after World War I, there's a bit of a shift in race relations, a great shift, really. And so trying to figure out how that tussle works in cultural ways. So increasingly, Black musicians are starting to record more, have control, a modicum of control over what Black music looks like. Whereas before this time period, it was really controlled primarily by white people. And I would say by the end of the 1920s, you start to have more Black musicians with national and international reputations. And so that's a big shift since before World War I. And so I'm trying to figure out, well, how are white people in Jim Crow segregation within this racial order, how are they grappling with that? And so I'm looking at the ways in which they sort of rehearse their own ideas about race as they try to dominate the jazz market. So hopefully that made sense.
Oh, absolutely. And it sounds like a really fascinating subject. Could you perhaps give us a little bit of background and context information? I really don't know a lot about early jazz, and particularly in this sort of socio-cultural context. So perhaps could you educate me a little bit on the subject?
Yeah, what kind of things are you interested in knowing?
Well,
I don't want to take too much time.
oh, well, I suppose you're focused on the business side of jazz, and that's more or less what we're here to talk about. So, where is it coming from? Where's the state of music as an industry, as a business at the time, and how does jazz fit into that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I'm still trying to figure that out. That's part of
Hmm.
the project, right? But as far as I understand it, being halfway through the book and through the research, is that recording technology exists. It has existed technically, since the late 19th century. And it in its inception was not understood in the ways that we understand it now. It was never thought to be a thing that would transform music from sheet music that is designed to induce performance, to then actually be the thing that captures that musical sound and we sell it as a product. So by the teens, basically, the equipment becomes more affordable, the technology becomes more durable, and it becomes really clear by this time that we're going to use this technology, this ability to record, create grooves in discs and cylinders that project sound. We're going to start using this to commodify music. And so there's a big shift around this time period throughout the 20s where we go from the thing that sells music is sheet music, and you buy it and you go home and you play, right, and perform, to the thing that sells music is a record or a disc, or yeah, so a disc or a cylinder, sorry. And we're going to buy that, go home and play it on our phonograph and listen to it. So there's a big shift here. And I really think of, and most scholars think of this moment right around World War I, where the recording industry begins. And I'm really interested in knowing about what jazz has to do with that, and not just like the particular sonic elements of it, but what is jazz as understood to be the most popular Black music at the time have to do with the formation of the recording industry. Does that help?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Hmm. So was jazz one of the leading popular music genres of the day, or is it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, colloquially speaking, it's the jazz age, right? Like that's what people sort of referred to it.
Yeah.
And it's still an inception. And so it's not always really clear what that means. What kind of music are we referring to? And this jazz historians, you know, for lack of a better term, get their panties in a wad about, well, that's not actually jazz, and I'm like, if someone's listening to it and they understand it as jazz, if someone is recording it and they understand it as jazz, then it's jazz. And we have to take it seriously as such. And so I think that that term was really permeating culture. And especially, the progress from the 1920s to I'm sorry, from the early 1920s to the late 1920s, it it becomes the kind of dominant cultural form that is understood to represent Blackness. And so part of my book is sort of working through what are the things that are maybe adjacent to jazz, like foxtrots or like peppy waltzes, right? But that people still understand to be performed by a jazz band or a dance band that they understand to be performing jazz. And how do ideas about Blackness, stereotypes about Blackness, how does racial inequality shape that, you know, big word jazz?
Hmm.
So
Is
yeah, I mean, I think initially it's not so popular. It's pretty controversial. And then, by 1926, 1927, you see a shift throughout, those post-World War I to 1927 or so is gradual acceptance, because the people that are in control of what culture gets to be disseminated are white people. And white people in the 1920s were pretty racist. It was a part of the system. And part of the system was about people believing that the music that they made was culturally inferior, or that the music that Black people made could have really deleterious effects on white people and white bodies. And so it was very controversial, but then it becomes gradually accepted into society and becomes sort of normalized. So I'm tracking that change. And again, sort of always tethering that my tracking of that change to what does this have to do with the recording industry?
Mhm.
Whereas jazz historians have always been wanting to track a change in the 1920s that's like, when does jazz actually become jazz as we think it should be? Like, well, they said it was jazz, but no, that's not, because I know better. And it's like, well, that's not very fair. As a historian, I feel like I just have to take what's given to me and not sort of, yeah, I don't like it, it's hokey. Or I'm like, yeah, I mean, it doesn't sound anything like John Coltrane. Well, duh, it was 1921. Why did they understand that to be jazz or jazzy or jazz-like? I want to make sense of that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that brings me to one of the important questions I wanted to ask you is how do you approach music studies as an through archival research? It seems like a really unique route into music through the archives, and I'm wondering if you could sort of elaborate upon that a little bit.
Oh, I'm not sure I'm the best person to do that. It's hard. I mean, I think, part of why I learned about Hagley was through the work that Rebecca Jeffroy Schwinden was doing. And she was an NEH fellow for a year, and she's a good friend of mine. She's at University of North Texas. And I came to visit her and I was like, what is this place? Oh, it has, it's actually this incredible site with a wealth of archives about American history, American business history. And let me see what I can make sense of in here. One of the things that I remember her saying is like, people think there's not a lot of music in here, but there is. You just have to sort of look for it in different ways. And so one of the things she was doing is looking through, writings maybe that reference music, right? Like you're not getting sheet music, but you're learning about the day-to-day musical labor and interactions that everyday people are having. That's her project. And so I was sort of inspired by that and thinking, well, what can I learn from these documents that are not inherently musical? I can't play them, I can't read them as a score, I can't listen to them, but they tell me something about what music meant in that time period. And I'm interested in this first chapter and what did it mean financially? Like what was the kind of investment potential in it? How did company infrastructure and kind of rapid growth in the recording industry have an impact on what musical styles circulated, what was popular. So I primarily at Hagley was like looking at business documents, which I think is pretty fun and exciting, just like crunching numbers sometimes. But so I looked at a lot of the RCA Victor collection that is there, and it's massive. And I looked at the first 10 boxes, I believe, of that collection that were primarily on the not origins, but like an early history of Victor before they got purchased by RCA in 1929. And so that's what I was interested in. I got to I haven't crunched the numbers yet because that's another post-archival research, task. But I got to see a lot of like, well, what was their quarterly profit statements for each year? What were their business plans for expanding as the demand for recordings became higher? What styles did they see and promote as the most valuable? Where does jazz fit in with that? So yeah.
I'm wondering, how did it make business sense to promote jazz music, which was associated very closely with Black American culture and Black American artists, in this context of entrenched systemic racism? What was the business calculus there?
Right. I mean, there wasn't. And for Victor especially, that really was, the most successful recording company during this time period. They put a lot of stock culturally and financially into classical music. And they had these Red Seal record series that was just mostly about a kind of what they perceived to be what middle and upper class consumers would want to listen to, what people with purchasing power would want to listen to. And it wasn't like always formally classic. It could be something a little on the light classic side, but it certainly wasn't jazz. And Victor was one of the later companies to actually adopt jazz. But it is so hard to find some of these early business documents from recording companies that I knew that the Victor stuff was at Hagley. So I wanted to use it as a point of comparison because it's just this rich source of documentation that we don't get from other prominent companies. But companies like Columbia, they picked up jazz earlier because they were willing to take a little bit of a risk, right? Part of being in business is taking some risks, seeing if maybe it would be profitable. And it turned out for Columbia to be profitable. But it was actually the smaller independent record companies that took that risk first because they could, because the stakes were lower for them, right? So actually, Carl Hagstrom Miller, among other people, have written about sort of these independent companies and how they tried to monopolize this new market, and how they could do it because of, because the stakes were low financially for them. And it worked. They were really successful. OK Records is a good example of, Ralph Peer recording some of the first working class music by white and black people and marketing it and being unbelievably successful. And so then Columbia and then Victor like hop on the bandwagon and they're like, oh wait, black people have money? And it's like, yeah, duh. Like black people want to hear, yeah, absolutely. Like, so it was a kind of awareness by white executives that there's this untapped market that has potential. And there's another facet to this, especially with Victor, that is interesting to me, is that there were white musicians like Paul Whiteman, especially, who had a contract with Victor for a while and was their leading artist. Exceeded Caruso eventually in sales in 1921 and 1922. And he was promoting himself as a jazz musician that had a jazz band. They didn't always use that term, but it was central to his reception, and he was incredibly successful. And what he did was take musical idioms that were associated with jazz, that were associated with ragtime or foxtrots or the shimmy and all of this black dance music, and he softened it a little bit with his arrangements and made it more digestible, if I can use that word, for middle-class white audiences who, because of their opposition to black culture, their belief that it was, inferior or could have negative effects on them, they would not want it sort of raw and unfiltered, but Whiteman was filtering it for them in a way that was like, oh, okay, well, a little jazz solo here. Okay, not too long, maybe a little, we're going to pretend like we're improvising, but we're not quite, or like pretty straightforward form. And then the last chorus will get a little, rhythmically ruckus, but then we'll bring it back down. So, he was really important for making jazz palatable to white audiences who otherwise wouldn't have sought it out. And that he made so much money from it, which is problematic. On the flip side, it's sort of an Elvis story too, where he helped these, middle and upper class audiences become more adjusted sonically to this sound. And then eventually starts getting more acceptable, starts taking more risks, starts really relying heavily on Black cultural sounds. So I don't even remember. Oh, yes, because he was the leading Victor artist. So the Victor story is important to me, even if they weren't the most active in pursuing Black music. And in fact, they were the last to really take that risk. But yeah.
And it sounds like once they got around to it, they were very serious about commodifying it and
Yes.
making it as widely acceptable and, as you said, digestible or consumable, really, as possible.
Right. Yeah.
I'm wondering a little if you could say a little bit more about what you found in the Hagley collections. Were there any set of sources or documents that just really made the light bulb go off for you?
Okay, I'm gonna look at my notes now because I looked at so much that um so I'll tell you a little story that is so weird, but also a part of I love doing archival research. Part of that is I'm introverted and I love like just sitting in silence. I'm really fascinated with understanding myself, ourselves, contemporary culture through the lens of the past. I don't know why, but that really fascinates me. And it gives me guidance for how to live my life now, because I have this understanding of what it used to be like, right? And how that used to be like impacts us. So how did that early recording industry, how is it still shaping our recording industry today? So I love kind of digging in and figuring out, it kind of feels like solving a puzzle. What document can make this story kind of thicker and denser? So one of the things I'm doing in my first chapter is looking at an agent, a music agent, a white music agent whose collections are held at the Institute of Jazz Studies, and his name is Ed Kirkby. And I was interested in where he got his training because, of course, wherever you train, it affects your business practices, right? So how does his training affect how he, draws contracts up with Black musicians or, decides who to manage and where to put them and what venues and what styles they should play, who gets royalties, that kind of stuff, deciding percentages of royalties. The agents in the 1920s were all in charge of these really big decisions. And his collection is quite extensive. But there's not a lot of information about his training, which comes from a thing called the Alexander Hamilton Institute. I don't know if anybody will think this is interesting, but I'm curious. I just find it fascinating. And the dean of NYU's basically like School of Economics would receive so many kind of inquiries about like, well, how do I get good at this? Business is expanding. Like, how do I become a successful manager, train a sales team? How do we, make sure that we're profitable? So he decided to like create a kind of mail order education, which is very interesting. It's got, master class written all over it, but 100 years ago or more. And Kirkby studied these texts quite closely. And so I'm getting insight into what are the managers that have the most amount of power over Black musicians and how to manage them, how to market their music. Who's informing their thought? Who's teaching them, how to do this? And Hagley has a large collection of these publications. So you have almost the entire like modern business series. But the quirky thing that I found was in the John J. Raskin papers. And he was president of finance for the DuPont company at some point, which I hope anybody listening to this knows who the DuPonts are. If they don't, that's another issue. But he had a receipt from this subscription. He also subscribed to the Alexander Hamilton Institute. And so I got to see, who is subscribing to this? What caliber of person is doing this? And how is it informing, the economic decisions that they make that have a real material impact on people? And then I actually got to find out how much it cost. And that was like the most exciting thing to me because I'm like, I was trying to figure out Kirkby's like economic position, is he upper class? Is he middle class? And I got to get my number right. I'm pretty sure that I found out that it costs like over $2,000 in today's adjusted for inflation. That's not a small chump change. Like I would never pay $2,000 for masterclass, like you're lucky if you're getting $10 from me. So I was shocked by that. It helped me understand that this was, it's not a formal education that ends in a terminal degree, but it was clearly something that people took seriously because you invested a lot of money into it. And then it tells you that kind of training is only accessible for middle or upper class people, primarily white people. So it was one document, but I was like, oh my God, this helps me so much. And it's like, 4 digits in the entire book that's going to be like 90,000 words and a footnote, but it just means so much to me. So it was very cool to find that at Hagley.
Oh, I just love that. The way just the smallest piece of evidence can be so illuminating.
Yeah, majorly. Yeah,
Yeah.
transform your argument. I mean, that's why the archives are so powerful.
Mhm. Now, race has run like a thread through our whole conversation here, but I'd like to make it a little bit more explicit because you said part of your aim with your project is to help us better understand how white people were constructing their ideas of race and particularly ideas of whiteness around their consumption of jazz music and or perhaps around their conception of jazz as well. Could you perhaps explain that a little bit further?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think that's I hope the crux of the book and what I hope to sort of like unveil to readers.
Hmm.
So I'm still trying to figure some of this out in each chapter is like, what does this actually look like? I think one of the things that I want to get across to readers, which is very important to me, that today racial inequality is still an issue. It's still very much prevalent. And again, this goes back to I'm curious about how we got here. Like, how are we here in what feels like a very advanced time in, the history of humanity? And going back 100 years, which seems like a long time, you see so many corollaries. Like, I'm reading things about jazz that I've heard white people say about hip hop. And
Mhm.
so a lot of times I read these things and I'm like, dang, have we even changed? Like what? And it's sad, but we have changed. The progress is aggressively slow, and that's infuriating. But what I want to sort of convey to audiences, even if they're not interested in jazz, I don't care, is that um, racial inequality, a real belief that Black people should be segregated, that they should not have access to the same rights, to the same resources that white people should have, has fundamentally altered the recording industry. So the copyright laws that come from the early 20th century, they still exist today. And they were initially designed to exploit musicians, and they're still exploiting musicians and not taking serious the value of musical labor. And what I want to convey to audiences is, to what degree did race have to do with that? How did, by the 1920s, Black music really becoming front and center in ways it had not before, how did that shape the formation of the industry? How did it shape its exploitative practices? And this is also a time period when the second Ku Klux Klan has its highest membership in 1926. And so is there a corollary in the sort of, well, now Black music is becoming more popular. It's actually being recorded by Black people. There's an increased sort of Black cultural dominance. It's called the Jazz Age, right? Um, how does that influence a desire to form white vigilante groups? There's that side of things, but there's also a less violent and less aggressive racism that still really matters. And maybe it's in the form of Paul Whiteman being the largest profiteer of Black music. Or maybe it's in the form of, the way a flapper wants to be in proximity to jazz as a way to express rebellion from white gender norms, right? So I want to use Black music in this moment so that I can, be rebellious against what my parents want. Um, so there's gradations of it. There's a continuum of racism, but they're all problematic. So I want to unpack some of that more quotidian racism and think about how it's still with us today in the industry.
Well, Steph, that's such an interesting project, and I really can't wait to read your book.
Oh, yay,
Thank you so
good.
much for taking the time to share your work with us today. It's been great.
Well, thank you so much, Greg, and thank you for these questions. These are fantastic. Yeah, I really enjoyed talking to you.
Oh, thank you, and you're welcome. And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library, join us online. You can visit hagley.org. That's HAGLEY.org. Don't be a stranger.